We're knitting Eyelet Insertion version 2. So I've knitted my main yarn silk mohair, and I'm now just going to knit the contrast yarn on a larger needle. Now if you have one circular and one straight needle, then this is the time to use the straight needle. So I'll knit across in the contrast yarn on the larger straight needle. So we've knitted across the row. We'll just cut a 4 to 6 inch or 10 to 15 centimetre tail that we'll use for weaving in later. We'll cut the main yarn as well, just leaving a tail. Now we're going to move on to the second part of our eyelet insertion pattern, and that starts with a provisional cast on. For the provisional cast on, I am using a very long circular needle in the correct size, and I'm going to be holding those two ends together. So that's what my circular needle looks like. We'll make a slip knot, leaving a tail that would be appropriate in length for the number of stitches we cast on. I'm only going to be casting on 24 stitches for this sample. And we'll put the slip knot on the upper needle, like so, and hold the two needles together. Now I've got the ball of yarn at the top for version 2, and my tail yarn is down below. The yarn from the top, which is my ball of yarn, will form the stitches on the lower needle, and the yarn from the bottom, which is my tail yarn, will form the stitches on the upper needle. We're going to hold both the tail and ball yarn together, like so, grasping it like so, but we'll separate them using our thumb and index finger. So holding the ball yarn at the top and the tail yarn over my thumb at the bottom. Our slip knot forms the stitch on the top needle. Now we're going to create a stitch on the bottom needle by bringing the yarn below the needles, and I actually do this by moving my needles upwards, and back through the middle of those needles, bringing the yarn back up to the top. To create a stitch on my upper needle next, I'm going to bring the yarn through the middle of the needles, and I do that in part by moving the needles. So the yarn goes between the needles and around the top. Top yarn goes below the needles and through the middle. Bottom yarn goes through the middle and around the top. So we're just going to keep repeating that until we've cast on the correct number of stitches. If your pattern says to cast on 100 stitches, then that means you need 100 stitches on your top needle and 100 stitches on your bottom needle. Because you start with a stitch on your top needle, you'll always finish with a stitch on the bottom needle. I've finished casting on my stitches, finishing with a stitch on the lower needle. Now I'm going to turn my work around, and we just want to make sure that our yarn at the back of our work, those two yarns, the tail yarn and the ball yarn, actually twist around each other like so, because that secures each stitch to the other side. Now we're going to just pull the lower needle through so that those stitches are now sitting on the cable, and that gives us some space to knit the stitches on the upper needle. We're going to be using a larger needle and changing to our contrast yarn. And this time I'm going to be using a cable needle, and we'll show you why at the end. So I'll knit across those stitches in my contrast yarn. I've knit across those stitches in my contrast yarn. We're just going to cut the tail here. Now you can see when we grafted those two contrast rows together, we are going to place the top part of our garment at the back and the bottom part of our garment at the front. So we'll need to slide our cable needle along so that our graft will be going from right to left. We'll be holding our needles together like so. For the graft, we've put together another instructional video. Some people find it easier if there's a bit more distance between this cable needle and our provisional cast on. So I'm just going to show you how we restart our knitting. To do that, we're going to have the wrong side facing. We'll slide our contrast yarn back onto the cable, and our provisional cast on will slide back onto our needle like so. So our wrong side is facing, you can see the purl bumps there. With our ball of yarn, not with the tail yarn, we're going to be purling along our first row of stocking stitch. So that's our first purl row done. We'll turn the work around and continue in stocking stitch. I'd probably do a couple more rows and then I'd come back and do my eyelet graft.